Introduction to Active Directory and Basic Installation. In this nugget, we're going to be discussing a few different things related to Active Directory as we introduce it. One of those would be some of the Active Directory advantages. You'll see that it's going to really simplify your life, at least compared to other network systems. We also take a look here at Active Directory structure. There's a lot of different ways that Active Directory can appear based upon how many domains you have. We also take a look at the basic Active Directory objects. There's many of them, but we'll take a look at the ones you'll administer on a regular basis, such as user accounts. And then we'll take a look here at the end at just doing a basic Active Directory installation, creating a user account, and then joining a computer to that domain so that we can have a logon in the domain and start to take advantage of Active Directory. Have you ever had trouble remembering anything? I know I certainly have. I'm probably just getting old. But I remember my family and I were watching a movie the other night, and I can't for the life of me remember the name of it. I remember what it was about. I remember the story. I even remember the actors' names. I think it was Sam Worthington and Elizabeth Banks. And it was this movie about some man on a ledge. Other than that, I can't seem to remember the name of the film. Now, you might be saying to yourself, James, what in the world does all that have to do with Active Directory? Here's what it has to do with. If you don't have Active Directory, you may have to have the world's best memory. It might have to be nearly photographic. Why do I say that? Because of this. Let's say that this is your computer here in the middle. I'll even put you in here. Okay. Hopefully you look something like this guy. Hopefully you have more hair than this person, so I'll put a mohawk on you. But anyway, so you got your computer here that you log on to, and you have a logon server that you probably do that with. So in other words, you log on to your PC, probably communicates with the logon server of some type. Could be a Windows one, but it could be anything. Anyway, you have a username and password you have to memorize for that. Likewise, you may have a database that you have to access as well. Well, it may have a totally separate and independent username and password that you have to memorize. You may also have a file server up here. Again, you may have a separate username and password for that one, as well as your email. Again, another username and password. And this could just be for your own company over here. Okay. To make things worse, you might have some kind of a partner organization or another division within your company that partner. Let's see if we can spell that correctly. Partner organization. Anyway, you may have to have a totally separate set of accounts for all of these things over on their side of things, which doubles your username and password burden. Making it even more complicated, your email system may have, let's say, a 7-character password. This one may have a 12-character password. This may have a 14-character password, and this one may have, I don't know, 6, whatever. So they're all different. So you can't even use the same password for all of these in many cases. So it gets to be very complicated, especially when you add in the fact that some of them will have passwords that expire at separate times. Maybe this one expires after 45 days, this one after 30 days, this one after 60 days, and so on. Now, I've kind of put somewhat of a worst-case scenario up there, but there are definitely organizations, especially governmental ones, where there's a lot of bureaucracy involved, where you have to cross-sign on to other systems that aren't part of your main division or main branch of the government. You have to sign on to some other branch of government, and this kind of thing can be very complicated. That's why you have to have nearly a photographic memory just to memorize all of this stuff. Well, let me show you how Active Directory can simplify a lot of that. What if we were to have this situation? Did you see this subtle change? Look at all the labels under there. Okay, this is what we had before. This is what we have now. Yes, people, I'm using Photoshop magic to do all of this for you. Anyway, what we have now is, here's your user account still. Okay, I'll make you look more attractive by making you bald here, like me. Anyway, now I have a Windows Server 2012 domain controller. I have a single sign-on, okay, SSO. So I log on once to this domain controller, and through the magic of something called Kerberos tickets, which we won't delve into in detail right now, but the basic idea means that I will now have a ticket associated with my logon here. Let's just call this a ticket. And it can be used to gain access to all of these other servers without having a separate username and password. So if I'm using Microsoft Exchange that's integrated into Active Directory here with my domain controller, then I don't have to sign on again to get my email. Also, if I want to access some files or even printers that are shared, well, I don't have to have a separate account for that. I just use my single sign-on from my original logon to my domain controller. SQL, if I'm using Microsoft SQL and I'm using domain accounts, again, I don't have to log on separately for that. Likewise, even if we did have a partner organization, remember this is our company over here, and this is our partner. Okay, if we have this partner organization and all of their systems run independently of ours, we can even use other things such as trust relationships, okay, Or to make a kind of a bigger trust relationship, you could have a federation, which is great in multi-domain environments. Federation. I can't spell anymore, folks. Sorry. Anyway, I could have a trust or a federation over here. And what that basically does is it's a two-way trust relationship. So if we have a user account down here, it's trusted to access resources over here, almost the same as if my user account were created on this domain controller over here. So again, I still have a single sign-on, but not only can I access resources on this side of the diagram, I can also access resources over here, all without having to have a separate username and password. Now, besides the benefit of a single sign-on, we really need to address what Active Directory truly is. I mean, when you first install a Windows computer, whether it's a server or a workstation, there's no domain involved at all. They're all standalone or workgroup computers. And that's where you would have to have separate usernames and passwords all over the place. It's really a mess. So with Active Directory, it helps to tie all of that together into a single organization. It starts off with a database known as the ntds.did or NT Directory Services Directory Information Tree file. You won't be tested on that in particular, but really Active Directory is just the ntds.did file that's on one or more domain controllers. So although your computers are standalone at first, when you decide you want the benefits of Active Directory, you'll install Active Directory Domain Services on a server. I'll show you how to do that later on. And then it will contain this file where you'll start entering in your users and your groups and your computer accounts. All those sorts of things will go into that file, as well as many other Active Directory objects. Once you've created that, you'll have your first domain controller, and then you can add additional domain controllers to that domain. By the way, a domain in Active Directory is the same as a DNS name. So in our demonstrations for CBT Nuggets, we have nuggetlab.com for the most part. Okay? And then there can be additional domains besides that one, such as, east.nuggetlab.com and west.nuggetlab.com. And you might have other domains for various divisions within your company and so forth. But at least initially, you'll have this domain right here, or whatever the name of your company or domain you want it to be. This is all based on a really old standard. It's decades old, called the X.500 standard, which most people never really use because it's a very thick standard, and it was kind of heavy. So what they did was they lightened it to something called the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Now, those of you that are well adapted and well versed in all things Active Directory know that I've skipped over probably a dozen steps in between this conversion. But anyway, you won't be tested on it anyhow. That's just part of the history. I did bring this up, though, because you'll see LDAP referenced a lot. Again, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, a big part of Active Directory. And then we take a look here at Kerberos as well, in brief at least. Kerberos is the security mechanism that's built into Active Directory. It's also not invented by Microsoft. It's used in many other kind of authentication schemes as well. But the advantage of Kerberos is that it doesn't transfer the actual password over in network, so it's secure in that respect. Also, once a user is logged on, it uses what we call a ticket granting system, where the user will then have a ticket, a TGT, ticket granting ticket, that they can present to other servers and workstations throughout that same domain, or even other domains if you have a trust relationship, which we may talk about a little bit later on. Anyway, once you have that ticket granting ticket, you can present it to other servers, and what it will do is it will identify that that was initially issued by a trusted domain controller, and based on that, it will allow the rest of the transaction or the rest of the authorization to take place. Also, with Active Directory, it's got consistent synchronization across peer domain controllers. I may have mentioned earlier that you could have more than one domain controller. I mean, after all, you don't want a single domain controller for tens of thousands of users. What happens if it catches on fire? Well, then you've stranded all of your users and have no way of letting them log on, so you'll normally have many domain controllers in large organizations. It's very important that all those domain controllers contain the exact same information. You wouldn't want one domain controller to have one password for a user, and then another domain controller to have a totally different password for that same user. Well, the user would be confused and would never know how to log on, right? Well, Active Directory uses a synchronization mechanism that ensures that you have consistent data across all the domain controllers. It's also extensible. Now, we don't really discuss that much here in our current topic, but this basically means that you don't have to take Active Directory just the way it appears out of the box. If you have programmatic knowledge or you're very well adept at modifying or working with Active Directory data, there are tools that you can use to dig into Active Directory to expose parts of it that are not normally seen in any of the other tools that you'll have. For example, if you wanted to work with Active Directory to add a GIF file to each user's account, then you could show a picture of that user when you open up their account. There are ways of exposing all of that. You would have to come up with some kind of a development resource in order to make that happen, but at least it's available. So you can kind of extend the availability or the capability of Active Directory. And also, it does interoperate with other forests or domains. Now, normally, we're going to talk about the difference between these two things, but you'll start off with a domain, for example, and maybe you want to interoperate with another domain. Maybe it's a partner or something like that, or another division within your company, and you need to exchange resources back and forth, and you need to prove that each of the domains can trust the other domain's users. Well, that's how the interoperation works there, through trusts or federations or things like this. Other important things to understand with Active Directory is the structure of Active Directory. So you'll start off with the base unit of Active Directory. You have to always start with a domain. When we take a look at this, just ignore the rest of this diagram for the time being, except for this one right here. Let's say we were starting a new company today. It was called nuggetlab.com. Well, we would create this right here, a first domain with a first domain controller. Maybe this is my first domain controller right here. Once I've done that, I now have an Active Directory infrastructure with my single domain controller, and then I can, of course, add other domain controllers or other components of Active Directory as you see down here, but we start with at least a single domain. If you don't have a single domain and at least one domain controller, you don't have Active Directory. Notice again, as I said, that it all follows DNS naming conventions, so nuggetlab.com, for example, in this example. And that's because Active Directory is fully integrated with DNS. Now, I also might need more than a single domain in my infrastructure, and that's where I would come up with a tree infrastructure, as we see here. A tree would be just like that. It would have, a source, and it would have kind of branches. It would have a branch down here and a branch down here. What happens in a tree is that I can still trust all the way around. For example, I might have a user here, and I might have a file share up here, and this user can access that file share if we grant them permissions. Likewise, we might have maybe a SQL database over here, and that user, if they've been granted permissions, can access that SQL database over in this other domain as well. What happens here is we create what we call child domains, and this, in this case, as you can see, reflects geographical boundaries, is why we created these domains. Well, when they're created within what we call the same forest, then the trust relationship is transitive. So this user can be trusted not only here, but it can also be trusted here, and all the way around. Any user in any part of this tree structure can be trusted elsewhere throughout the organization. However, they're only trusted insofar as they've been granted permissions. If I never granted this user permission to this folder, well, they can't just access it just because they're part of my tree right here. So to summarize that, when I start with this parent domain up here, and then I create child domains down here that are part of what we call the same forest, which I'll talk more about here shortly, then there's an automatic trust relationship that's built in there. So when we talk about forests, which you've heard me mention a couple of times here, what is that really? When we take a look at this domains over here again, and let me clean this up a little bit so it's a little bit easier to see. If I just started with nuggetlab.com and that was the only domain that I ever created, then I would still have a forest. The forest is the totality of all of your Active Directory infrastructure. Okay. If I create a child domain, then I now have a tree structure. Again, if I create another child domain, I still have a tree structure only because I have, something else branching off, so to speak, from my original parent domain here, west and east. Okay. This is both a tree and it is also now a forest. Just my forest, instead of containing a single domain, now contains a total of 3 domains. The other way we look at forests is that we see forests when we have more than a single namespace. So here I have a parent namespace of nuggetlab.com, but over here maybe I've got another division that's part of our same company that we still own, accusource.net over here, for example. Well, if I join this domain when I create my first domain controller to this existing forest, then there's going to be built in here a two-way transitive trust, meaning that, again, if I have a user down here, they can access any of the resources to which they've been granted permissions in this domain, this domain, this domain, this domain, this domain, and this domain, okay, all the way throughout. And now my forest includes both of these top-level namespaces as well as any children that are associated with it. We talk about forests, generally speaking, we think of this whole thing here where we have multiple namespaces and where you can access resources all the way throughout. However, technically, as I said earlier, a forest could be a single domain like this if that's all I ever created, or it could be this single domain in these childs, whatever I've done here. But generally speaking, we think of forests, people kind of colloquially think of it as separate namespaces. It really just kind of depends on the context that you're discussing. Now then, how does a forest differ from something called a trust? Let me show you that. I've kind of cleaned up my diagram over here. And let's say that we had this whole organization operating on its own, and then AccuSource.net and its child domains over here was created completely on its own. In other words, when the AccuSource.net domain was created, it was not told to join NuggetLab.com. We didn't even know they existed. We just did our own thing over here, and we had our own forest. So this is forest 1 over here. This is one forest, and this is another forest over here. Okay, no relationship whatsoever here between the two of them. All right. Now, what turns out to happen is NuggetLab.com, maybe they buy AccuSource.net. Okay, so now what we need to do is to be able to have our users and resources completely interchangeable back and forth, or at least to some degree. So what we could do there is we could create a forest trust, which would basically give us the same relationship I talked about earlier, where any user could access any resources to which they've been granted permissions throughout both forests here. Or we may just want to go only a certain level. Maybe we don't want NuggetLab.com users accessing our secret research down here, but they can access this domain right here. So what we could create is a trust relationship that goes this direction here. So we will trust the users here, and we could also create a trust relationship so that they would trust our users here. And when we do this, we could now have a user here that can access resources such as a folder over here. It looks kind of like a boot. It's a very misshapen boot. But anyway, this user can now access this folder over here because of this trust relationship. Okay? Because AccuSource.net has trusted NuggetLab.com and inherently the users in that domain. This is probably going beyond our current exam a little bit, but you do have to understand this when you work with multiple domains for practical reasons. That's why I'm explaining all of this. Now, if I have a user over here, once again, I need to trust, or the NuggetLab.com needs to trust my users over here. That way they can also access things such as my shared folders or any other resources I have over there. Notice that when I just create a manual trust, and I'll write that up here, manual trust, okay, that there's no transitivity in it. In other words, just because this trust relationship is created here, notice that it is limited to only this level. This user cannot access resources down here. This user cannot access resources down here or down here. Okay, it's only at that specific level. We could then create separate trusts also going this direction, like this, but then you get quite a lot of arrows up here and my diagram gets messy. But that's a lot of manual trusts that are created, and that's what we used to have to do way back in the old days of NT 4.0. If we know in advance that we really want to have trust going all the way around here, actually let me just clean it up entirely, then what we would do again is to create the forest trust, okay, that would allow us transitive trust all the way throughout both trees here. Otherwise, we could just create those manual trust relationships to only specific domains in each forest. And then a federation is kind of what I just described over here and we've looked at before. And that's where, again, when we first establish our relationship with AccuSource.net, we know that both organizations want to access all resources throughout all domains and all of the children. Then we'll just create a federation here. That's actually kind of a trust relationship as well. It's just that by creating the federation, it automatically creates the transitive trust to all the children instead of just a manual trust only locked into specific domains in both forests. And then within our Active Directory domains, we have Active Directory objects. Not much point in having a domain if there's no objects to manage because you don't have anything to do. So what we'll have here is things such as user accounts. And there's a lot of objects besides what I've listed here, but these are the ones that you'll probably most commonly work with on a day-to-day basis. Of course, the user account is what allows you to log on to the domain and access resources throughout based on your username and password. You're also granted access to resources not just on a specific user account, which is certainly possible, but you can also be granted permissions based on your group memberships, and that's going to be a little bit more common. But you have to create that Active Directory object known as a group, and then you have to place users or other groups nested inside of that group. Then we'll talk. We have a whole section on that as well later on, how to work with and manage your groups. You'll also have computer objects. One of the things that you'll do once you've created a domain is you'll add your workstations and other servers to the domain, and then now those computer accounts are part of the domain, and they will also usually belong in organizational units. All of these top three things normally will belong to or be inside of an organizational unit, or an OU is what we normally call that. And that's what an OU is. It just contains other objects, and the reason why we want to do that is because if you think about it, what if you had 60,000 user accounts and 60,000 computer accounts? Well, that's 120,000 accounts, right? If you had all of that just in one container, wouldn't it be difficult to scroll through and to find a specific user? I mean, there's search engines that you can, search tools that you can use and stuff. But regardless, it would still be difficult to scroll all the way up and down sometimes, and it would be slow on performance as well. So that's why we have organizational units, one reason, so that it's just easier for administrators to find what they need to work with. Also, and you'll see this as later on when we talk more about organizational units, it helps us to divide up our users and computers into things such as geographical areas, divisions, specialties, cost centers, things like that. Then we'll also have sites and site links. Let me show you about that here as well. If I go over here, we'll see that I've got a diagram relating to sites. So here, for example, we have a diagram that shows a single domain in two sites. Now, very often in the real world, especially in global organizations, you may have thousands of different sites and many, many domains in each site. But for simplicity's sake, here I've got my nuggetlab.com domain. Now, ignoring Tucson down here, let's just say that Phoenix was the very first place that I started this company, and I installed my first domain controller right here. And when I did that, I had a single domain inside of a single site, end of story. Okay. Also notice that I have a specific IP address range associated with this particular site. That's one of the ways sites are defined, is by the IP address range that they have there. So anyway, that's what I've got, a single domain controller in a single location. Now, I decided to add other domain controllers, but they're still going to be in other sites here as well. I guess I should make that more sense. 2 and 3 domain controllers here in the same domain in the same site. But at this point, I still have a single site. Let's say, though, that we have a lot of customers that need our services down here in Tucson, and so we decided to open an office down there. Well, it wouldn't make any sense to open up Tucson.com or some other domain down here, because then I would have to come up with some creative ways to access the resources in the domain up here. So I want to keep the same domain of nuggetlab.com. I just installed a fourth domain controller down here, and then maybe a fifth and a sixth. But they're all domain controllers for the same exact domain. That way I don't have to create any fancy trust relationships or a federation or anything like that, or expand my forest in any direction. It also has, again, its own unique IP address range that we see down here. And then we'll have a site here called Tucson. Now, the site is an area of high-speed connectivity. So here I'm on a LAN. It's probably 100 megabits per second or a gigabit E network, which means 1,000 megabits per second. They're separated by some kind of a WAN link, and this could be just kind of any connectivity. It could be a dedicated WAN link, which usually gives us slower performance than when we get in our WAN. It might be, for example, a megabit per second, something like that. Or it could be part of our internet. So maybe we're both connected to the internet, and we created a virtual private network, or a VPN, across a public internet here. And a virtual private network simply protects the data so that people can't just sniff it off the public internet and see anything secure in it, such as confidential data. So anyway, here we would have a couple of sites. Now, this kind of also begs the question, why do we even have to create separate sites? I know that Tucson is physically located, an hour and a half away from Phoenix, or a couple hours, but do I really have to create its own site down here? Couldn't I just take their domain controllers and put them in the Phoenix site? You actually could do that. The problem there is that it will create replication cycles and replication traffic that you don't want. Instead, what we want to do is we want to save up replication traffic so that every few minutes it'll replicate data on these domain controllers down to these so that they can converge. Otherwise, if we put them all in the same site, then even though they are physically distant, they would still act in replication as if they were in the same server room, for example, and they would have a lot of replication traffic, which would be an inefficient use of our slower bandwidth here. And so that's why we use two separate sites with a site link. By the way, this will be called a site link right here. And this is something that you also define in Active Directory as an Active Directory object. All right, so let's actually go about installing a domain controller. Now, one of the first things I want to point out to you is that in the older versions of Windows, you would go to a command prompt and you'd type DC promo, but that doesn't work anymore. And you'll see that here that the Domain Services Installation Wizard is now relocated to Server Manager. Okay, so we don't do the command line version of that anymore. Now what we do is we go to Add Roles and Features, and everything that you need to install the domain controller will be included in this. Also, I want to point out that let's say I had my domain already in existence. Maybe I had a Windows Server 2008 domain controller, for example, and now I want to add a Windows Server 2012 domain controller to that existing domain. That's certainly possible, and that's going to happen commonly as people start to roll out Server 2012. Now, when you do that and you join this domain controller to the domain, it will now automate a lot of the processes that we used to have to do manually. For example, in the upgrade from Windows Server 2003 to 2008, you would have to run adprep /forest prep and adprep /domain prep, and what that would do is it would modify the Active Directory schema of the old 2003 Active Directory to the 2008 Active Directory. Now, we had to do that because the schema is kind of the skeletal structure of Active Directory, and it defines how objects are created and managed and what they kind of look like, more or less. Well, now that's all been included in this. So if I were to add roles and features, and we're going to add Active Directory domain services here, then it would go ahead and run forest prep and domain prep automatically as part of this process, and I wouldn't get caught short and have to cancel the wizard and go back and figure out how to do all of that. So to start the wizard, this is going to be much like what you'll do for a lot of the different roles and features that you install. You just click on Next, and we want to install a role-based or feature-based installation for our local computer here. And we have only one server here. But in remote administration later on, especially when you have a domain involved, you can add a bunch of different servers in here. And I can actually do the same function on multiple computers at once, which makes it pretty handy, so that I can avoid having to do it separately on each different one. Okay, then I want to add Active Directory domain services here, so I'll check the box, and it will then automatically add in other tools that I will need. Okay, so I'll go ahead and add those items in here as well. Then I'll go ahead and click Next, and click Next again, and then Next again. And then I'm just going to install it and let this run. When it's done, I'll come back and we'll take a look at what we have to do next. While I'm waiting for this, by the way, let's notice this that we have down here, this Export Configuration Settings. If I were to click on that item, notice that will then bring up for me, if it ever does, there it goes, it brings up an XML template for me. This is just something that I can then use to apply to other servers at some point in the future. It's not really part of the exam per se, but it's just kind of a handy item if you have multiple machines that you want to configure the same way. It might be very easy to work with that XML. All right, once the wizard has completed, notice that I can immediately click right here to promote this server to a domain controller. But if I just reflexively click close and I totally forgot to do it, then what I could do is go over here to ADDS. Notice that it's now added this item onto my console over here at the left. And then it tells me that configuration is required for Active Directory domain services. All I have to do is to click More over here and promote this server to a domain controller. So then I'll just go ahead and do that this way, kind of assuming that I may have forgotten to click on that, for example, and we'll continue on. Now what I can do is to add a domain controller to an existing domain. This is what I was talking about before. If I maybe already had a Windows Server 2008 domain in place, and I was going to add this 2012 to that existing domain. Or I could add a new domain to an existing forest. That would be, for example, if I wanted to create, let's go back to our diagram. If I wanted to create one of these child domains, but we're not at that stage yet because we haven't even created a single domain yet. So I'm going to go ahead and add a new forest. This would be what I would select if I were to create my first domain in the company. It'd be the first domain in the new forest. All right? And then I'll just tell it what it's going to be, nuggetlab.com. And then we'll click on Next. Once we've clicked on that, what it's going to do here for a moment is it's going to look out using DNS and other methods to see if there's already a domain by that name in the organization somewhere. It doesn't find it, so it lets me proceed. Notice that it gives me a forest and a domain functional level. What in the world is that about? Well, a forest and a domain functional level relates to how many features you get in that Active Directory infrastructure. Here, it's not going to let me choose some of the older ones because it's the first forest in the domain, so it's kind of like, why would you go backwards to 2008? But if I were adding an additional domain to an existing forest or adding an additional domain controller, for example, then I could choose a down level forest or domain functional level. As you go down level, it kind of strips features off of the new fancy shiny knobs and buttons that 2012 has, and you go backwards to some of the previous versions there. Also, I need to make this a DNS server, a domain name system server, and that's again because Active Directory is fully integrated with DNS, and it allows and supports things such as dynamic update, for example. Also, I will make this a global catalog. This is what's going to contain objects from every domain in my forest. Right now it's pretty simple because I only have one forest anyway. And then I could also make it a read-only domain controller, which we're not addressing particularly right now, but in short, it allows me to install a domain controller that would be read-only, meaning that I could not create or modify accounts on that domain controller. Very handy in things such as smaller branch offices where I might not have the physical security I need. If somebody were to steal that domain controller or to compromise it somehow, they could not modify my accounts, for example. The next thing you need to do is to provide a directory services restore mode password. This is a password that will be used in case of troubleshooting Active Directory. So something's not working properly or you've got other problems with that machine, then you can boot into a directory services restore mode, which means you're not using Active Directory directly, and it's kind of offline at that time. Well, if that's the case, you can't log on with an Active Directory account, so you need to use the administrator's directory services restore mode password here. And I'll just enter one in. Okay, and then we'll just click on Next. Just make sure you don't forget that and you have a record of it somehow. Now, at this dialog box, it's telling me that it cannot create a delegation for this DNS server because a parent zone can't be found. Well, that's kind of a no-duh message because I'm creating the parent zone. So, of course, there's no parent zone that can be found. That's a little bit more of DNS details, but you'll see that commonly in these installations, it's not really anything to be alarmed about, especially when you're creating that very first domain in your forest. Then it also will scan the network to see if it can find a NetBIOS name called Nugget Lab, and if it can't, then it allows me to click on Next. If it does find one that's already in existence out there, then it will give me a warning there. So we'll go ahead and click on Next here. At the next dialog, we'll see, I think it tells us at least where, yeah, exactly, where we store various components of Active Directory. There's a sysvol folder where constituent parts of Active Directory are stored in files. There's also a log file location and a database location. That's where our ntds.dit file is going to be stored. I'm going to stick with the defaults here, but if you want to store them elsewhere, you certainly can. Microsoft used to recommend that you store these in separate locations for performance reasons, but it's really not that much of an issue, so a lot of folks just keep them on the same hard drive and location now as the default specifies. And the next thing you will have here is just a summary of everything that it's about to do, and you can kind of go through that if you like to. Then what we could also do, though, and this is very interesting, we could do this new feature where it says View Script. Wow! What in the world is this about? Yeah, you guessed it, PowerShell. Using this now, I can say, hey, I know I've got to do a lot of this, and maybe I've got to do this on multiple domains or something like that, or maybe I've got to create a bunch of child domains. So what I could do is to copy all of this into Notepad and then save it as a script that I can use at a future point in time. And then maybe if there are other domain names that I can put in here, I'll just put in the name of that domain here and the name of the domain for NetBIOS name here, but maybe I'll change everything else. So that's what this is about. By the way, you can kind of just make sense of what this means just by reading through it. It kind of provides the answers that I've already done in the graphical user interface here previously. Now, the only other thing to explain is this item right here. That's a backtick. And what that means is that it allows it to be more readable, actually, because it puts all the different instructions on separate lines. But the backtick will provide the same execution as if all of these were on the same line. If I were to do all of this in kind of the literal PowerShell method without using the backticks, all of this would have to be on the same line. It'd be kind of difficult to read, that's all. Okay, so then we'll go ahead and click on Next, and we'll let this domain install itself. When it is finished, we'll come back and take a look. Now then, before it actually does the installation, it will tell you here just some messages. These are, again, nothing to be concerned about. This is relating to an old NT4 compatibility issue, but if you had to make it compatible with NT4, you'd have to weaken security. We don't really do that anymore. It's a very bad idea. And then this is just the DNS issue I talked about earlier. It does a lot of prerequisite checks, and if one of these give you a red symbol pointing out that it's kind of a showstopper, you can't really proceed at that point, then you can try to go back and fix it and then rerun the prerequisites check. By the way, this version of Active Directory in Server 2012 is very, very efficient and thorough in running the prerequisite checks. This is one of the most common calls to Microsoft Support Services for domains, is people running into problems with doing the installation because they keep running into things that are not compatible, or maybe there's a forest prep that didn't get run or something like that. Well, Microsoft takes care of a lot of that for us here now, and is much more clear about things that are not working. So once you do that, you click on Install, and this will take a little bit of time, and we'll continue on. All right, now after the installation of Active Directory Domain Services, you'll now notice that you have ADDS here, or Active Directory Domain Services, and DNS. Now let me just go to DNS briefly. We're not going to address that in a lot of detail right now, but what we'll do is I'll just click on this, and then I could go to the server and right-click to choose DNS Manager. This is just another way of accessing that console. Notice that I could have also gone up here to Tools, and then chosen DNS from here as well. Either way actually works. And then what we'll see here is that, as I mentioned before, Active Directory is integrated into DNS. And as I open this up, we'll see that NuggetLab.com does have a zone here. And within that, we see the only object that's been created so far, one of the only objects, and that is the server itself, which has a host record now, meaning that I can locate it by the fully qualified domain name of dcnugget1.nuggetlab.com. And it will take me to this IP address. Okay, so that's one of the things that we see there, and I'm not going to explore that too much fully more right now. Then the other thing is, I could go up to Active Directory Domain Services, and likewise, again, I can right-click here and choose whichever Active Directory tool is applicable. Commonly, we'll use Active Directory Users and Computers, and one of the first things I'd probably do in a new domain is to create an organizational unit to put my user accounts and my computer accounts in. Probably a separate organizational unit for each. So I'll right-click on the domain and choose New, and then I would choose Organizational Unit here, and I'll just call this my NLab Users. Notice that there's a protect container from accidental deletion. This means that, well, I'll show you what that means. Now, let's say that I created dozens or hundreds of accounts in here, maybe even thousands. Well, if I thought that I was clicking on some other item in Active Directory and I right-clicked on it and I said, you know what, I just need to go ahead and delete that item. Are you sure you want to delete it? Yes. Oh, you know what? Oh, I can't because it's protected from accidental deletion. Oh, that wasn't what I wanted to delete anyway. You see what that does? It gives you kind of that hiccup that prevents you from deleting something really important, and your organizational units are normally critically important there. But once I've created that, I can right-click on the OU directly or over here in an empty space, either one, and right-click to choose a new user, and then I can just call this person a new user, and I'll say there, Joe User. How about that? Joe User, and then next, and I'll just give them a password. You have to make sure that they match. Hopefully my typing is good enough. And then generally you'll just click next and finish. And then this would cause the user to have to change their password at the next logon, because right now I know what the password is because I typed it in. But by checking this box, it gives me plausible deniability, because that user will then log on and be prompted to change their password. I will no longer know it. Therefore, I could not be accused of knowing their password, logging on as them, and doing something malicious. So it's kind of a good security measure there and gives you some protection. Also, you could choose user cannot change password, which is often what you'll do for service accounts, because if that service account ever got compromised, you wouldn't want the malicious party to be able to change that password and prevent the service from running anymore. Most services require some kind of an account to be associated with them in order to have the authority to run, and that's what this would often be part of. Password never expires. Same thing. With a service account, you usually do not want the password to expire after 30 or 45 days or whatever, because then, well, the service will stop running. Okay. Also, you could choose account as disabled. Let's say that person's not really starting work yet. They're coming in next week. Well, I could disable the account until they actually get here. That might prevent it from actually being used and open up or prevent a narrow window of potential security vulnerability there. Oops, the passwords don't match. I'll try that again. Okay. If only I knew how to spell SpongeBob. Okay, so the user must change password to the next logon. Like I said, that's a common item that you'll see there. I'm actually going to clear that for this instance, but we'll click on Next and then Finish. And now we've got Joe User here. Notice that if I double-click on it, I've got all kinds of additional things that I can enter in that I did not have available when I first created the account. We may discuss that a little bit more later on as we discuss accounts, but for the time being, just know that the reason they weren't available is because you can only have those fields available once the account is created. In the first wizard that you saw there for creating a new user, there was no account yet, so I didn't have these things available. And then here I'm on a Windows 8 computer, and I want to join this computer to the domain so that the user can log on here using their domain account. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to type Control Panel, or just type Control, and Control Panel shows up over here. And then I'll just go ahead and go to that, where I can go to System and Security, and then System, and then I want to go down here to Change Settings underneath the computer name, domain, and work group settings. Notice that it's a member of the work group right now, but I want to change that to make it a member of a domain, in particular the nuggetlab.com domain that I created earlier. So I'll click OK here now, and I'll enter in credentials for someone who has the authority to do so, to join this computer to a domain. And the trainer account is our normal administrative account that we use here at CBT Nuggets. And so we can see that I've joined it to the domain successfully. This will require a restart, so I'll click OK here again. And once I do so, it will restart the computer. Will be part of the domain. And now you can see here I'm logging on under the Nugget Lab domain as Joe User. Since the computer is a member of the domain, I can now use a domain account to log on to this machine. All right, as we wrap up here, oh, great Scott! I remembered the name of the movie I was trying to think of at the beginning of this video. The one about a man on a ledge. I think it's called A Guy on a Ledge. All right, in this nugget we talked about Active Directory advantages. For example, you don't have to have like a half a dozen username and passwords to access all of your systems. At least conceivably it could be that way. Active Directory would give you the advantage of being able to have a single sign-on. That's just one of the advantages. We also took a look at how Active Directory might appear in a structural manner, such as a single domain, a tree, a forest. We looked at things such as federations and trusts. We also took a look at Active Directory objects, primarily things such as users, groups, computers, but there are other things such as sites and site link objects. We also took a look at the end here at an Active Directory installation, which is actually very easy, and Microsoft has really streamlined this, and moreover, they've helped to kind of build in more prerequisite checks and troubleshooting checks before you get to the end of the wizard. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.